At a crowded family dinner, I gripped the edge of the linen tablecloth and gasped that the baby was coming. My mother did not panic. She wiped a drop of fluid off her shoes, threw a $50 bill on the table, and sneered, "Call a cab." "I am busy." She left me there in agony to go look at evening gowns. 3 days later, when she showed up at the hospital trying to take my newborn from my arms, she found out the hard way what happens when you push a medical data analyst too far. My name is Riley. I am 33 years old, and I am about to tell you how I systematically dismantled my toxic family without ever raising my voice. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized the people who should love you the most are the ones you need to protect yourself from. The chandelier above our table at Le Petit Chateau cast a warm glow over the crystal glasses, but I felt nothing but a freezing knot of dread in my chest. We were supposed to be celebrating my mother Brenda's birthday. I was 38 weeks pregnant, my ankles swollen and my back aching. I only agreed to come because my husband Ryan was thousands of miles away, deployed on a naval carrier. As a military spouse, the isolation can be suffocating. I thought being with my mother and younger sister Ashley would bring me some comfort. I was completely wrong. Ashley was showing off pictures of expensive dresses on her phone. She was attending a gala that weekend and insisted my mother help her pick a gown. I tried to focus on my breathing, but an agonizing cramp seized my lower abdomen. I shifted in my chair, hoping it was just a false alarm. Then a rush of warm fluid soaked through my maternity dress and puddled onto the polished hardwood floor beneath my chair. I gasped loudly, grabbing my stomach. "Mom!" I choked out the pain, stealing the air from my lungs. "My water just broke. The baby is coming." The conversation at the table abruptly stopped. Several wealthy patrons at nearby tables turned to stare at the commotion. I reached my hand out toward my mother, expecting her to jump up to call an ambulance to act like a mother. Instead, Brenda slowly looked down at the floor, then at her pristine red sole heels. Her face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. "Look what you did to my shoes!" she hissed, her voice trembling with anger. "You ruined my birthday dinner, and now you are ruining my shoes." I stared at her, my vision blurring rapidly from a massive contraction that ripped through my entire body. I could not comprehend what she was saying. "Mom, I need to get to the hospital," I pleaded, gripping the heavy mahogany table to keep myself from collapsing. "Ryan is not here. I cannot drive like this. Please." Brenda rolled her eyes, let out a dramatic sigh, and opened her luxury handbag. She pulled out a crumpled $50 bill and tossed it across the table. It landed right in my untouched salad. "Call a cab," she snapped coldly. "I am busy. Ashley has her final dress fitting at the boutique across town in exactly 20 minutes, and they will charge us a cancellation fee if we are late." I looked over at Ashley, hoping for a shred of humanity. Ashley simply took a sip of her sparkling water and shrugged. "Sorry, Riley, but this appointment took me 3 months to book. You will be fine. Women give birth every single day." They stood up, grabbed their coats, and left me clutching my stomach in the middle of a crowded restaurant. The sheer cruelty of their abandonment hit me much harder than the physical pain. I managed to pull myself up, leaving the $50 bill sitting in the salad bowl. The restaurant manager rushed over and offered to call an ambulance, but I shook my head, pride and adrenaline pushing me forward. I stumbled out the heavy glass doors into the freezing parking lot, each step sending bolts of lightning through my spine. As I leaned heavily against a concrete pillar to catch my breath, I looked back through the large restaurant window. My mother and sister were walking out a side exit. Ashley turned her head, made direct eye contact with me, and a slow, malicious smirk spread across her face. That smirk told me absolutely everything I needed to know right then. This was not just selfishness. This was a calculated move. They wanted me to be completely alone. I fished my car keys out of my purse with trembling hands, biting my lower lip until I tasted blood. The freezing air whipped around me as I dragged myself toward my car. Every step felt like walking on shattered glass. I unlocked the door and collapsed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I knew the risks of driving myself in active labor. As a medical data analyst, I had read the statistics on maternal distress and traffic accidents. But I had no choice. I started the engine and threw the car into drive, my mind racing faster than my heartbeat. The streets were slick with fresh rain reflecting the glaring streetlights that burned my tired eyes. I focused on timing my breathing. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold. Exhale. I had barely made it onto the boulevard when the dashboard screen lit up, breaking the tense silence. The Bluetooth incoming call chime echoed through the speakers. The caller ID flashed Jackson. Jackson is my 32-year-old brother-in-law. He is a brilliant African-American man who built a successful tech company from the ground up. He is the only person in my family who ever treated me with genuine respect. I tapped the answer button on the steering wheel, trying to keep my voice steady. Jackson. I gasped, another severe contraction tightening my stomach. I cannot really talk right now. Riley, thank God you answered. Jackson shouted over the speakers, his deep voice cracking with pure panic. The sound of screeching tires echoed through his end of the line. Are you okay? Where are you right now? I blinked, confused by his frantic tone. I am driving, I managed to say, gripping the wheel harder. My water just broke at the restaurant. I am heading to the hospital alone. Jackson let out a sound that was half sob, half sigh of relief. Okay, listen to me. I am on the highway right now trying to get back from the city. Ashley just called me crying hysterically. She said she went into early labor at dinner, and your mother is rushing her to St. Jude Hospital. She told me you were fine and took an Uber home because you did not want to deal with family drama. The words hung in the cold air, freezing the blood in my veins. The physical contraction tearing through my body suddenly felt completely insignificant compared to the absolute horror washing over my analytical brain. What did you just say to me? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. She is in labor. Riley Jackson repeated, his panic escalating again. The baby is coming early. They are at St. Jude. I am pushing 90 miles an hour trying to get there. Just tell me you are safe so I can focus on getting to my wife. My mind violently snapped the terrible puzzle pieces together. Jackson and Ashley had a miserable marriage. For the past 2 years, he had been mentally exhausted by her constant reckless spending, her manipulative tantrums, and her absolute refusal to sign a post-nuptial agreement to protect his tech wealth. 6 months ago, Jackson had finally packed his bags and handed her official divorce papers. He was entirely done, but exactly 3 days later, Ashley miraculously announced she was pregnant. It was the only thing that immediately stopped the legal divorce proceedings. Jackson, desperate to be a good father, moved back into their sprawling estate and put his entire life on hold for a child he truly believed was his own. For 9 months, Ashley kept her pregnancy fiercely private, letting only our mother attend ultrasounds. She wore loose clothing and posted vague updates online. And now, on the exact night my water broke, she was claiming to be in labor at St. Jude Hospital, the exact facility where my maternity file and insurance were registered. I stared at the dark road, Ashley's malicious smirk burning behind my eyelids. She left me alone intentionally. They needed me out of the way. They needed a baby, and they were planning to use my medical records to steal one. I slammed my foot on the brakes. The tires squealed against the wet asphalt as the car jerked to a halt in the empty intersection. Riley Jackson yelled through the speakers, hearing the screeching tires. What happened? Are you okay? I took a shaky breath, the betrayal transforming into pure rage. Jackson, I said, my voice dropping to a mechanical calm. Turn your car around. What are you talking about? He demanded. My wife is having my baby. I stared at the glowing red traffic light above me. No, Jackson, she is not. Because Ashley is not pregnant. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of Jackson's turn signal. Riley, what are you saying? He stammered, his voice laced with confusion and rising fear. You are in active labor right now. You are delirious from the pain. I am a data analyst, Jackson. I snapped back, my voice gaining a terrifying clarity despite the searing agony radiating from my spine. I look at patterns for a living. Think about it objectively. Has anyone besides my mother actually attended a single ultrasound appointment with Ashley? Have you ever felt the baby kick against her stomach? Has she ever let you come into the examination room with her? I heard Jackson draw a sharp, jagged breath over the speakers. No, he whispered, the denial draining from his voice. She always said her high-risk doctor only allowed one support person because of strict clinic policies, and your mother insisted on being the one to go. My hands squeezed the leather steering wheel so hard my joints ached, and my fingers went numb. They are setting us both up, Jackson. I explained, the horrifying truth clicking into place with undeniable certainty. Ashley has been faking this entire pregnancy for 9 months just to stop you from finalizing your divorce. She desperately needs a baby to secure her claim to your tech company wealth and lock you into a permanent financial arrangement. And tonight, when my water broke at the restaurant, they saw their golden opportunity. They left me there alone on purpose. They knew I would have to drive myself to St. Jude Hospital. They are waiting for me there right now. They plan to use my vulnerable state, drug me up during delivery, and forge the medical paperwork to pass my newborn child off as hers. Jackson let out a sound of pure anguish, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Oh my God! He choked out, the betrayal crashing down on him. Riley, they cannot do that. That is completely insane. It is not insane. It is a calculated theft, I replied, fighting through another blinding wave of pain. My mother has forged my signature before to steal my college funds. Doing it on medical release forms to secure a multi-million-dollar trust fund for her favorite daughter is exactly what she would do. You need to pull your car over right now, Jackson pleaded, his voice breaking with genuine terror for my safety. Call an ambulance immediately. If you go to St. Jude, they will corner you and manipulate the hospital staff. I am turning my car around to come get you. Do not go to that hospital. A massive contraction hit me so hard, my vision briefly tunneled, turning the streetlights into blurred streaks of yellow. The pain was a violent ocean threatening to pull me under, but the fierce primal instinct to protect my unborn daughter burned much hotter than the physical agony. I looked up through the rain-streaked windshield. Just a quarter-mile ahead was the highway exit for St. Jude Hospital. I knew if I took that ramp, Brenda and Ashley would intercept me at the emergency doors. They would play the role of the frantic family, claim I was hysterical, and take total control of the situation. I would be trapped in a sterile bed, unable to fight back against their lies. I absolutely refused to let my child be born into their toxic web of deceit. I refused to be the helpless victim in their twisted game. I checked my rearview mirror and slammed my foot hard on the accelerator. I gripped the wheel tight and violently swerved across 2 lanes of heavy highway traffic. Horns blared angrily all around me, tires splashing through deep puddles of water as I cut off a massive delivery truck, but I did not care. I missed the exit for St. Jude entirely and merged onto the interstate heading south. Jackson heard the blaring horns through the Bluetooth connection. "Riley, what are you doing?" he yelled in sheer panic. "Where are you going? I am taking control of the board." I gritted out, my breathing heavy and rapid. They think I am weak because I am alone. But they forgot exactly who my husband is. I pushed the speedometer higher, the engine roaring loudly as I sped down the dark, slick highway. I am not going to a civilian hospital where my mother can just walk through the automatic doors, I told Jackson, my voice turning to pure steel. I am heading to the Joint Military Medical Center. Ryan is a senior commanding officer, and my military dependent identification grants me full access to the base. The entire facility is located on a highly secure federal installation. It is a literal fortress. They have heavily armed guards at the gates, strict biometric checkpoints, and military police constantly patrolling the medical wards. My mother and sister cannot even get onto the base without top-tier federal clearance. I am going to have this baby behind heavily armed walls where they can never reach me. As I sped toward the massive guarded military complex, I knew one thing for certain. The war had just begun. I slammed the brakes as my sedan careened into the brightly lit emergency drop-off zone of the Joint Military Medical Center. The front bumper bumped hard against the concrete curb, jarring my spine, but I was finally here. The blinding security floodlights washed over my windshield, casting stark shadows across the dashboard. Almost instantly, two heavily armed military police officers sprinted toward my vehicle, their tactical boots pounding loudly against the wet pavement. They saw my face, pale, dripping with cold sweat, and contorted in absolute agony. One of them immediately pressed a radio to his shoulder and barked an urgent request for a medical trauma team. "Ma'am, stay exactly where you are," the officer commanded, his tone authoritative, but incredibly reassuring. He pulled open my driver's side door just as another brutal contraction ripped through my abdomen, forcing a guttural, uncontrollable scream from my throat. The freezing night air rushed into the car cabin as the officers carefully helped me unbuckle my tangled seatbelt. A team of nurses burst through the automatic sliding glass doors, pushing a heavy steel gurney toward us, its wheels clattering loudly against the concrete. They reached out with gloved hands to lift me, but I planted my feet firmly on the ground, gripping the edge of the car door with every ounce of strength I had left. "I am not getting on that bed until I speak to the charge nurse," I shouted over the chaotic noise of the emergency bay. My voice was ragged, breathless, but absolute. A tall woman in dark blue scrubs stepped forward, her face serious, her silver name badge identifying her as Lieutenant Commander Hayes. "I am the charge nurse," she said calmly, placing a warm hand on my trembling shoulder. "Honey, you are in active labor. We need to get you inside right now. Your baby is coming." I locked eyes with her, refusing to let the agonizing pain break my intense focus. "I am a medical data analyst," I stated, breathing heavily through clenched teeth. "I know my federal rights under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I am officially invoking a Level 4 privacy blackout protocol. I want my real name completely scrubbed from the main hospital directory immediately. I want an alias assigned to my medical chart, and I want a strict, hard lock placed on my electronic health records. Nobody gets in. Nobody gets information. And if anyone calls this facility asking for me, you are legally required to tell them I am not here." Nurse Hayes blinked clearly, taken aback by my highly specific technical demands while I was literally doubling over in pain. "Ma'am, a full blackout protocol is extreme. It requires a verified threat assessment," she explained, trying gently to guide me toward the waiting gurney. I grabbed her forearm, my fingers digging into the fabric of her scrubs. "The threat is my own mother." I choked out tears of sheer desperation and rage, finally spilling over my eyelashes. "When I was 18 years old, she maliciously forged my signature on federal loan documents to steal my entire college fund. She took out massive credit cards in my name, drained the accounts, and destroyed my financial future before my adult life even began. Right now, she is at a civilian hospital across town, waiting to forge my signature on medical release forms so she can steal my child for her own financial gain. She is a master manipulator who knows exactly how to exploit the healthcare system. If my real name shows up anywhere in your registry, she will find a way to track me down and access my room. You have to hide me. Please, I am begging you to hide us." Nurse Hayes stared at me, processing the raw terror in my voice. The standard protocol hesitation vanished from her eyes, replaced instantly by fierce, unyielding military protectiveness. She turned to the nearest military police officer. "Get her inside right now," she ordered sharply, her voice cutting through the chaotic noise. Then she looked back at me, her expression turning into a mask of pure determination. "Do not worry about a thing, sweetheart. You are officially an alias patient. As of this exact second, you do not exist in our system." I finally let my tight grip loosen, allowing my exhausted body to collapse onto the padded gurney. The nurses immediately pushed me through the heavy sliding doors, the bright fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway flashing above me. The automatic locks clicked firmly shut behind us, sealing me inside the impenetrable military fortress. Officially, Riley had vanished from the face of the earth. The sterile smell of alcohol and iodine filled my lungs as Nurse Hayes wheeled me into the trauma delivery suite. The heavy metal doors sealed shut with a final resounding thud, isolating me completely from the outside world. I was entirely alone. My husband Ryan was an ocean away serving his country. The woman who gave birth to me was currently plotting to steal my child. The stark reality of my solitude could have easily broken me right then and there. But as another brutal contraction ripped through my abdomen, ripping a raw scream from my throat, I did not feel sorrow. I felt an overwhelming burning rage. That rage became my absolute anchor. The medical team worked with military precision. Wires were attached to my chest. Monitors beeped rhythmically in the background, and an intravenous line was swiftly inserted into my vein. The pain was an ocean threatening to drown me. I gripped the cold metal side rails of the hospital bed, my knuckles white, my whole body trembling violently. The fetal monitor suddenly blared a harsh, urgent warning tone. Nurse Hayes leaned over me, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "Riley, your blood pressure is dropping dangerously low," she warned, her voice tight with professional concern. "The stress is putting both you and the baby into distress. We need you to push now. You have to find the strength to push." My vision blurred at the edges, dark spots dancing across the bright surgical lights above me. My exhausted muscles screamed in protest, begging me to just give up and slip into the dark void of unconsciousness. But then my mind flashed back to the restaurant parking lot. I saw my mother staring at her designer shoes with absolute disgust. I saw Ashley looking over her shoulder, a malicious smirk painted across her face as she left me to suffer alone. They thought I was weak. They thought they could easily break me down, drug me up at St. Jude Hospital, and rip my daughter away from me to secure Jackson and his massive tech fortune. They thought I would just roll over and let them destroy my life like my mother had done when I was 18 years old. A primal protective fury ignited deep inside my chest. I locked my eyes onto the ceiling tiles and let out a guttural, feral roar. "I am not letting them win," I screamed, bearing down with every single ounce of strength left in my battered body. I pushed until my lungs burned. I pushed until the monitors screamed. I pushed for the little girl who would never ever know the toxic poison of my bloodline. "One more big push," Riley Nurse Hayes encouraged loudly, her hands expertly guiding the process. "You are doing incredible." I gathered the very last reserve of my energy, squeezing my eyes shut and pushing with a ferocity I never knew I possessed. A sudden massive release of pressure flooded my body, followed instantly by the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. A sharp, loud, demanding cry pierced the sterile air of the delivery room. My head fell back against the damp pillow, tears of absolute pure joy streaming down my face. "You have a beautiful, healthy baby girl," Nurse Hayes announced with a warm, genuine smile. She quickly wiped the baby down and gently placed the tiny crying bundle onto my bare chest. I wrapped my trembling arms around my daughter, feeling her rapid heartbeat against my own skin. She was perfect. She had a shock of dark hair just like Ryan, and tiny clenched fists that already looked ready to fight. I pressed my lips to her warm forehead, whispering softly that I would protect her from the monsters of the world. For a few perfect, uninterrupted minutes, the universe consisted only of me and my daughter. We had survived. We had won. The grueling battle of the last few hours faded away into the soft warmth of holding my newborn child. Then the sharp vibration of my burner phone shattered the peaceful silence. I had specifically packed a cheap, untraceable prepaid phone in my hospital bag for absolute emergencies, leaving my regular smartphone completely powered down in my purse to avoid being tracked by my family. The phone buzzed aggressively against the plastic tray table next to my bed. Still holding my daughter close to my chest, I reached over with a shaky hand and grabbed the device. The bright screen illuminated the dim room with a stark, terrifying automated text message from my medical insurance provider. "Fraud alert warning. We have detected an urgent request to access your maternity medical records and insurance portal from a terminal located at St. Jude Hospital. Your social security number was just manually entered at the pediatric triage desk. Reply 1 to authorize or call immediately. My blood ran ice cold, freezing the warmth of the moment. They were not just waiting for me. They were actively breaking into my life and stealing my identity. I immediately texted back a secure command code to lock my insurance portal, initiating a total freeze on my medical records. The nurse rushed in, alerted by the sudden spike in my heart rate on the monitor, but I waved her away. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist. Over the next 3 days, the secure recovery ward at the Joint Military Medical Center became my personal war room. While my body healed from the trauma of the solo delivery, my mind was running at full capacity. I used my encrypted laptop to systematically lock down every single piece of my personal medical and financial data. I set up alerts, changed passwords, and drafted a coded email to my husband's military lawyer. My beautiful daughter was thriving, currently down the hall in the highly restricted pediatric wing for her routine newborn hearing screening. I was alone in my room finalizing a data trace on the IP address that tried to breach my files at St. Jude Hospital. Then the heavy reinforced door to my recovery room suddenly clicked and swung open. I looked up, my fingers freezing over the keyboard. My mother Brenda pushed her way into the room, followed closely by Jackson. For a split second, I was genuinely shocked. This was a locked-down military facility, but then I remembered who Jackson was. His tech company held several lucrative Department of Defense software contracts. That civilian contractor clearance was the skeleton key my mother had desperately needed to bypass the lower security checkpoint. She must have spun a frantic, tearful story to Jackson about a family emergency to convince him to bring her onto the base. Jackson looked completely exhausted. Dark circles bagged under his eyes. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled, and his broad shoulders slumped with the heavy weight of the last 72 hours. He looked like a man whose entire reality was fracturing, but Brenda looked like she was ready for a theatrical audition. She practically sprinted into the room, her face plastered with a terrifyingly fake mask of maternal desperation. She was clutching a massive, expensive bouquet of pink lilies and a plush designer baby blanket. She completely ignored the dark bruises on my arms from the intravenous lines and the exhausted pallor of my face. Her eyes darted wildly around the sterile room, frantically scanning the empty corners and the neatly made secondary bed. "Oh, my poor, sweet darling," Brenda cried out, her voice dripping with artificial honey that made my stomach turn. She rushed toward my bed, throwing the flowers onto the side table and reaching her hands out as if she wanted to embrace me. I leaned back against my pillows, crossing my arms over my chest to physically block her unwanted touch. Jackson stepped into the room right behind her, closing the door quietly. He looked at me with a mixture of profound sorrow and desperate confusion. "Riley, I am so sorry to just show up like this," Jackson said softly, his voice rough and tired. "Your mother told me what happened. She said you called her in a panic, that things went horribly wrong. I had to use my federal clearance to get us up here. We have been out of our minds with worry." I kept my eyes fixed on Brenda. She was vibrating with nervous energy, her gaze still hunting for the clear plastic bassinet that was noticeably absent from the room. She needed the physical child. She needed her prize. Without the baby, her entire scheme with Ashley would completely collapse. The clock was ticking on Jackson's divorce, and Brenda was losing her mind. "Where is my beautiful grandchild?" Brenda demanded, her voice rising in a pitch of theatrical panic. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, playing the role of the distraught grandmother perfectly for Jackson's benefit. "You drove off all by yourself in such a terrible state. We were completely terrified. Please, Riley, tell me everything is okay. Let me see the baby. Let me hold my granddaughter right now." The silence in the room grew heavy, thick with the electric tension of a trap snapping shut. I looked at the frantic woman who had abandoned me in a restaurant parking lot when I was bleeding and terrified. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life viewing me as nothing more than a disposable asset. I calmly reached forward and closed my laptop. It shut with a sharp, decisive click that echoed in the quiet hospital room. I sat up straight, ignoring the pain in my abdomen. I looked Brenda dead in the eye, my face a mask of chilling apathy, and delivered the exact words I knew would destroy her narrative. "What baby?" The words hung in the sterile air, sharp and unyielding. Brenda physically recoiled, bringing a dramatic hand to her mouth. She let out a loud, theatrical sob that echoed off the bare hospital walls. Jackson stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What do you mean, what baby?" he asked, stepping closer to the bed. "Riley Ashley is in the maternity ward at St. Jude right now, recovering from a traumatic labor. She lost a lot of blood. But your mother said you also delivered that you were in a terrible mental state, and that we needed to come here to sort out the legal paperwork for the child." I kept my expression entirely blank, watching Brenda work herself into a fake frenzy. She turned to Jackson, tears streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks. "I tried to warn you, Jackson," she sobbed, grabbing his arm for support. "I told you she was not in her right mind. She has completely lost touch with reality." Brenda unzipped her oversized designer tote bag with trembling hands. She reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder, clutching it to her chest as if it were a sacred artifact. "I knew my daughter was too fragile for this," Brenda cried, looking back at me with a face full of faux pity. Jackson Riley did not have a healthy delivery. She suffered a tragic stillbirth. Her mind simply snapped from the grief. She is hallucinating that she has a healthy baby hidden away somewhere in this hospital. My heart slammed against my ribs, but my face remained an impenetrable mask of stone. The audacity of her lie was almost breathtaking. She was attempting to erase my living, breathing daughter from existence right in front of me. Jackson looked like he had been struck by lightning. "A stillbirth." He repeated, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "Oh my God. Riley, I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea." "Do not listen to her, Jackson," I said calmly, my voice steady and completely void of the hysteria Brenda was trying to project onto me. "She is lying to your face." But Brenda was already moving to the next phase of her calculated strike. She opened the manila folder and pulled out a crisp, official-looking document. It was stamped and notarized. She shoved it into Jackson's hands. "Look at it, Jackson," she wept loudly. When Riley realized her baby did not survive, the trauma triggered a complete psychotic break. She knew she was completely unfit to be a mother. She knew Ashley had just delivered your beautiful child across town. In her brief moment of clarity yesterday, she signed this kinship care agreement. She legally surrendered all future maternal rights to Ashley, agreeing that her sister is the only one stable enough to raise a child in our family. Jackson stared down at the paper, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. I could see the exact moment he spotted the signature at the bottom of the page. It was a perfect forgery of my handwriting, a flawless, meticulous copy of the signature my mother had practiced and perfected years ago when she stole my college savings. "She has a history of severe mental instability, Jackson." Brenda continued, her voice dripping with venomous faux concern. "She weaponized the darkest period of my life without a second thought. You remember her major depressive episode in her 20s, do not you? When she could not even get out of bed for 6 months. When we had to practically institutionalize her. Her brain is broken, Jackson. She signed this document giving Ashley full custody of the child she hallucinated, and now she is pretending none of it ever happened. She needs to be locked in a psychiatric ward before she hurts herself or someone else." I watched Brenda weave her sick tapestry of lies. When I was 22, I had suffered from severe clinical depression after my father passed away. I sought therapy, took medication, and completely healed. But in my mother's twisted mind, my past vulnerability was simply ammunition waiting to be fired. She was using my genuine mental health history to build a flawless profile of an unstable woman, paving the way for her to steal my newborn under the guise of an emergency family rescue. Jackson looked up from the forged document, his eyes wide with horror and overwhelming pity. He looked at the paper bearing my exact signature, then looked back at my mother, who was putting on the performance of a lifetime. The fake legal proof in his hands was incredibly convincing. The narrative of a grieving, psychotic mother fit perfectly into the chaotic story Brenda had spun for him all night. Then Jackson turned his gaze to me. He expected to see a shattered, hysterical woman sobbing over a lost child. He expected to see the broken girl my mother was describing. Instead, he saw a woman sitting perfectly upright in her hospital bed, her laptop closed beside her, her eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying clarity. He was caught dead in the center of the trap, paralyzed between the tangible legal proof held tightly in his hands and the absolute chilling calmness radiating from my face. Jackson opened his mouth to speak, but I did not give him the chance to voice his doubts. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or defend my sanity. Instead, I reached over to the remote panel clipped to the side of my hospital bed and pressed the red emergency call button 3 times in rapid succession. The shrill alarm echoed down the corridor outside. Less than 15 seconds later, the heavy reinforced door swung open and 2 military police officers stepped into the room. They were fully geared in tactical uniforms, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. The sudden presence of armed federal authorities sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. Brenda gasped, taking a quick step back and clutching her designer bag against her chest. Jackson froze, instinctively holding the manila folder up as if to surrender it. Officer Brenda stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. "My daughter is having a severe mental health crisis. You need to call the psychiatric ward immediately. She is completely delusional." I ignored her entirely and looked directly at the taller officer. "Sir," I said, my voice steady and commanding. The woman standing next to the bed just presented a forged legal document on a secure military installation. "I need you to secure it as evidence." The officer immediately stepped forward, holding his hand out to Jackson. Jackson, his eyes wide with shock, slowly handed the kinship care agreement over. I turned my attention back to my brother-in-law. "Jackson, look at me," I ordered. He blinked, pulling his gaze away from the armed guards to meet my eyes. "You run a massive tech company, Jackson. You understand data. You understand timestamps. Look at the bottom of that page you were just holding. What time and date were printed next to my supposed signature?" Jackson swallowed hard, his voice shaking. "It was dated yesterday, 4:30 in the afternoon." I nodded slowly, letting the factual weight of his words settle into the room. Then I reached for my laptop, opened the screen I had deliberately prepared before they walked in, and turned it around so Jackson could see the brightly lit display. "This is my official electronic health record verified by the military medical database. Look at the entry for yesterday at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. Read it out loud, Jackson. Read the specific medication and the surgical notes." Jackson stepped closer to the bed, leaning in to read the glowing text. His eyes scanned the digital chart, and I watched the color completely drain from his face. At 4:15, the chart says you were administered a heavy spinal anesthesia block for a minor postpartum surgical repair. Jackson read, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. At 4:30, you were listed as completely sedated and unconscious in the operating theater. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap. "That is correct," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. At the exact minute I supposedly signed away my maternal rights with a flawlessly steady hand, I was lying unconscious on a surgical table without any motor function from the waist down. I could not even hold a cup of water, Jackson, let alone sign a legally binding contract transferring custody of a child. Jackson slowly turned his head to look at my mother. The sheer horror in his eyes was absolute. He finally saw the monster hiding behind the designer clothes and the fake tears. Brenda looked like she had just swallowed broken glass. Her jaw tightened, and she took another step back toward the door, realizing her flawless plan was rapidly falling apart. I was not finished. I looked straight into my mother's panicked eyes, making sure she understood the massive gravity of her mistake. "You forgot where you are, Mother," I said, my tone ice cold. "We are not sitting in a civilian lawyer office. We are not at the county courthouse. We are on a highly classified federal military base. Presenting a falsified legal document to a military officer on federal property is not a simple civil dispute. It is a federal felony. It is identity theft fraud and a direct violation of federal military code. You did not just forge a signature today. You just handed these officers a guaranteed federal prison sentence." Brenda went completely pale. The heavy layer of makeup on her face suddenly looked like a tragic mask over ghost-white skin. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid as the two military police officers turned their attention entirely onto her, their expressions turning stone cold. Any rational human being would have surrendered right then. Any normal person would have broken down and confessed. But my mother was not normal. Her deep-rooted narcissism refused to allow her to lose control. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin defiantly, and completely refused to back down. Jackson could not breathe. The walls of the secure military hospital room seemed to be closing in on him. He looked at the two federal officers standing like statues, their hands resting cautiously near their weapons. He looked at my mother, whose chin was raised in that sickening display of narcissistic defiance, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just committed a major federal crime. And he looked at me, realizing he was standing right in the middle of a chaotic war zone he did not understand. He took a stumbling step backward toward the heavy reinforced door, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum floor. "I need air," Jackson muttered, his voice barely a rasp. "I need to call my wife." He practically fled into the sterile, brightly lit hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Through the small rectangular window in the door, I watched him lean heavily against the painted cinderblock wall. His hands were shaking violently as he pulled his smartphone from his suit pocket and dialed Ashley. I knew exactly how that conversation was going to play out. Ashley had spent years perfecting her role as the ultimate victim, and Jackson was her favorite audience. Jackson pressed the phone to his ear, his chest heaving with panic. Ashley answered on the very first ring. "Jackson, where are you?" she sobbed, her voice echoing through the earpiece loud enough that I could almost imagine it from inside my room. "I am lying here in a hospital bed at St. Jude, and you just disappeared. The doctors are asking for you. Where is my husband?" Jackson squeezed his eyes shut, desperate for a lifeline. "Ashley, I am at the military hospital with your mother and Riley," he pleaded, his voice breaking under the immense pressure. "Ashley, what is going on? Riley is saying the kinship care agreement is a forgery. She just called the military police. They are treating it as a federal crime. Please, you have to tell me the truth. Are you really in labor? Is the baby okay?" A sharp theatrical gasp came through the phone line, followed by the sound of hysterical, uncontrollable weeping. "How could you even ask me that?" Ashley wailed, launching into a textbook display of manipulative gaslighting. "Jackson, I just went through the most traumatic labor of my life to give you a child, and you are interrogating me based on the lies of a sick woman. Riley is sick, Jackson. She is a jealous, twisted monster. She lost her baby today. Her mind completely snapped from the trauma, and now she is trying to destroy the only good thing we have. She has always hated me because I have the life she desperately wants. She is trying to ruin our family. She is trying to take our baby away because she could not keep her own." Ashley laid it on incredibly thick, her cries sounding so utterly devastated that Jackson felt his heart physically ache. He wanted to be a father more than anything in the entire world. He had put his entire life, his impending divorce, and his hard-earned freedom on hold for the child she carried. The thought that his wife might be executing a monstrous criminal conspiracy alongside her mother was simply too massive for his brain to process all at once. Cognitive dissonance took over his logic. It was so much easier to believe that I was a grieving, jealous sister having a severe psychotic break than to accept that the woman he married was a sociopathic fraud who had manipulated him for nearly a year. "Jackson, please come back to me," Ashley whimpered, delivering the final devastating emotional blow. "I am so scared. I am sitting here bleeding and exhausted. I need the father of my child right now. Do not let her crazy delusions tear us apart." Jackson slowly hung up the phone, wiping a thick bead of cold sweat from his forehead. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to push down the overwhelming nausea churning in his stomach. He loved the idea of his unborn child too much to let it go. He pushed open the heavy hospital door and stepped back into my room, The standoff inside had not changed one bit. The military police officers were still waiting for my final command to make an arrest. Brenda was glaring at me with pure venom, silently daring me to cross her. Jackson walked right past her and approached the side of my bed. He looked down at me, his eyes pleading, begging me to be the villain so his perfect life could remain intact. "Riley, please," Jackson begged, his voice trembling with exhausted desperation. "I just spoke to Ashley. She is terrified and crying in her hospital bed. You are grieving, and I cannot even imagine the terrible pain you are going through right now. But you are tearing this family apart over a delusion. You have to tell these officers to stand down. Please, Riley, just stop this madness. Stop this." I did not flinch. I did not offer him a single ounce of sympathy. I reached out and pulled my encrypted laptop back onto my lap. I flipped the screen open, the bright light illuminating my face in the dim room. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the precise data trace I had been working on before they barged in. I looked up at him, my expression completely void of mercy. "You want madness, Jackson?" I asked, my voice slicing through the air like a sharp scalpel. "Let me show you what madness actually looks like." I held out my hand, demanding the device he was still clutching. "Give me your phone, Jackson. I want to see the ultrasound picture Ashley sent you back in January. The one she claimed was her 20-week anatomy scan when she refused to let you inside the examination room." Jackson looked down at his phone, then up at me, his eyes darting toward the military police officers, watching our every move. He hesitated before unlocking the screen and pulling up his messages. He handed the phone across the bed rail. My fingers brushed his, and I felt how cold and clammy his skin was. His nervous system was crashing. I looked at the brightly lit screen. There it was. A classic black and white sonogram showing the side profile of a developing fetus. To the untrained eye, it looked completely normal. It was the picture that had saved their marriage, the image that had stopped Jackson from finalizing his divorce. I set his phone down next to my encrypted laptop. I turned the screen toward him. "Jackson, my entire career is built on analyzing medical data," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "Every hospital and clinic uses a highly specific alphanumeric coding system for their imaging files called a DICOM header. It prints basic metadata right along the borders of the ultrasound image. It includes the date, the patient identifier, and the unique facility registry code." I pointed to the blurry white text running along the top edge of the sonogram on his phone. "Ashley cropped this photo tightly, but she was sloppy. She left just enough of the top margin visible. Read those first 5 digits for me, Jackson. The ones right before the date." Jackson leaned in, squinting at the small text. "It says 48201. He read, his voice shaky. I typed those 5 digits into the National Provider Registry database on my laptop and hit enter. The screen instantly populated with a verified facility profile. 48201 is the registry code for a boutique ultrasound clinic located in Austin, Texas, I read aloud. "Have you and Ashley taken any secret trips to Texas recently, Jackson?" Jackson shook his head slowly, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. "No. We have not left the state since last summer. She told me she had this done at the St. Jude Maternal Fetal Medicine Center downtown." I hit a few more keys, navigating to a reverse image search engine that I frequently use to flag fraudulent medical insurance claims. I dragged the ultrasound photo from his text messages and dropped it into the search bar. This algorithm scans the internet for exact pixel matches, I explained as a blue loading bar flashed. It looks for identical grain patterns, shadows, and contrast levels. Less than 3 seconds later, the search results populated. I clicked on the very first link and stepped back, letting Jackson see the screen clearly. The webpage that loaded was a popular mommy blog titled The Texas Mama. The post was dated nearly 6 years ago. Right in the center of the article, accompanied by a long paragraph about second trimester pregnancy, was the exact same ultrasound image. It was an identical pixel match. Every shadow, every curve, every tiny white speck of static matched the photo Ashley had sent him perfectly. She did not even try to hide the watermark when she downloaded it, I said, my voice completely devoid of pity. She just cropped it, applied a filter to make it look darker, and texted it to you. There is no baby at St. Jude Hospital. There never was. Your wife has been wearing a silicone belly pad for 9 months and playing you for a complete fool. The air was sucked out of the room. The silence was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Brenda backed away until her shoulders hit the wall, her face a mask of absolute terror. Jackson stared at the glowing screen, his eyes tracing the lines of the ultrasound image that belonged to a stranger from 6 years ago. His hand began to shake so violently that he could no longer hold on to anything. His smartphone slipped from his trembling fingers and hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack, the screen splintering into a spider web of broken glass. He did not try to pick it up. He stood frozen, his broad shoulders slumped inward, staring down at the shattered device by his leather shoes. The illusion was dead. The child he dreamed about, the nursery he painted, the future he sacrificed his freedom to build, none of it existed. His entire impending fatherhood was a fabricated lie. Jackson slowly backed away from Brenda as if she were radiating a toxic disease. He shook his head, his chest heaving as he stared at the woman he had called family for years. You knew, he whispered, his voice thick with devastation. You knew the whole entire time. You and Ashley fabricated this entire pregnancy to trap me in a marriage I desperately wanted to leave. You made an absolute fool out of me. Brenda looked down at the shattered phone on the linoleum, then looked at Jackson retreating toward the heavy hospital door. She realized in a fraction of a second that the game was entirely over. Jackson was lost. The multi-million-dollar trust fund, the estate, the lifestyle she and Ashley depended on, it was all disintegrating right in front of her eyes. And because she was a textbook narcissist, her brain could not process her own failure. She needed a scapegoat. The loving, frantic grandmother facade she had worn since she pushed her way into my room vanished instantly. Her shoulders squared, her jaw locked, and her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She slowly turned her gaze away from Jackson and locked her eyes onto me. You just could not let her have this one single thing. Could you? Brenda hissed. Her voice had dropped its theatrical high pitch, turning into a guttural, vicious sneer that echoed off the cold hospital walls. She took a menacing step toward my bed, completely ignoring the 2 armed military police officers who immediately tensed their hands, hovering over their tactical belts. You have always been the absolute cancer of this family, Riley. Brenda screamed, spittle flying from her lips as her rage boiled over. Since the day you were born, you have done nothing but ruin everything you touch. You always thought you were so much better than us because you were smart. Because you moved away and married a military officer. But you are nothing. You are a selfish, arrogant little brat who only cares about herself. I sat perfectly still, my face entirely blank. I let her scream. I let her expose exactly who she was in front of federal law enforcement and her wealthy son-in-law. Ashley needed that baby! Brenda yelled wildly, gesturing toward the hallway. Her husband was going to throw her out on the street. She deserves that lifestyle. She deserves to be taken care of. You have a husband who provides for you. You have a secure life. You could have just signed that paper, handed the infant over to your sister, and walked away. We could have all been happy. But no, you had to destroy your sister's life just to prove a point. You had to humiliate us. Jackson stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathic logic pouring from her mouth. You are insane, Jackson breathed out, his voice trembling. You are actually talking about stealing a human being like it is a piece of property. Shut up, Jackson. Brenda snapped, not even looking at him. She kept her furious eyes locked on me. You think you won this, Riley? You think because you pulled up some old blog post on your little computer that you have outsmarted me. I am your mother. I brought you into this world and I know every single one of your weaknesses. I will completely destroy you before I let you walk away with that child. I will make sure you never see the light of day again. If Brenda could not quietly steal my daughter through forged documents and manipulation, she was going to use the ultimate weapon of the state to rip my child from my arms. She aggressively reached into her oversized designer tote bag. She bypassed the useless forged contracts and pulled out her smartphone. Her manicured fingers violently punched in a number, and she pressed the device hard against her ear. She stared at me with a chilling, triumphant smirk as the line connected. "Hello, Child Protective Services," Brenda said loudly. Her voice suddenly shape-shifted again, returning to the frantic, terrified tone of a desperate family member. "I need to report an immediate life-threatening emergency regarding a newborn infant. My daughter Riley is currently a patient at the Joint Military Medical Center. She has a documented history of severe mental illness, and she is currently experiencing a violent episode of schizophrenia and postpartum psychosis. She is completely detached from reality. She is aggressive, unpredictable, and I have reason to believe she is in active, immediate physical danger to the life of her newborn child. You need to send an emergency intervention team to this hospital right now before she kills my granddaughter." I watched my mother lower the phone from her ear, a triumphant smirk playing across her perfectly painted lips. She had used the exact sequence of legal trigger words required to force an immediate institutional response. Schizophrenia, postpartum psychosis, immediate physical danger. In the eyes of the law, and especially under strict liability protocols of a federal military medical center, those words were an absolute mandate. The two military police officers in the room immediately shifted their posture. Their hands dropped away from their weapons, but their stance became rigidly procedural. One of them spoke into his shoulder radio requesting a psychiatric evaluation team. Jackson snapped out of his paralyzed state. He stepped forward, raising his hands defensively toward the officers. "Wait, you cannot do this," Jackson pleaded, his voice cracking. "You cannot just lock her up based on a phone call. She just gave birth. My mother-in-law is lying to you to cover up a fraud. You have to listen to me." The taller officer stepped squarely in front of Jackson, creating a physical barricade. "Sir, please step back," the officer commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "A formal report of immediate threat to a minor has been placed on a federal installation. We are legally obligated to initiate a standard 24-hour psychiatric hold and separate the mother from the infant until Child Protective Services conducts a full investigation. It is out of our hands." Brenda let out a dramatic sigh, pressing a hand to her chest. Thank goodness, she whimpered loudly, though her eyes were locked onto mine with a cold, victorious gleam. "Please make sure my granddaughter is safe. I will stay right here to coordinate with the authorities." I did not scream. I did not thrash against the sheets or beg the officers to believe me. As a data analyst, I understood exactly how algorithms and protocols worked. If I fought back or cried, I would only provide the exact behavioral evidence my mother needed to validate her fabricated claims of psychosis. So I remained perfectly still. I kept my breathing slow and my expression utterly neutral as a team of psychiatric nurses entered the room. They gently but firmly helped me out of the bed, placing me into a wheelchair. Another team of neonatal nurses headed for the pediatric wing to take custody of my daughter. My heart physically ached, but I forced the emotion down. I would not give Brenda the satisfaction of seeing me break. As they wheeled me out into the hallway, Jackson stood against the wall looking completely defeated. He had seen the proof, but the sheer chaos of my mother's counterattack had paralyzed his ability to act. Brenda stood next to him watching me go. She offered me a small, sickeningly sweet wave. It was the wave of a woman who believed she had won the war. They took me to the psychiatric observation ward on the 4th floor. The room was stark white and entirely barren. There were no sharp edges, no medical equipment, and no windows. A female nurse systematically stripped me of my personal belongings. She took my clothes, my shoes, my encrypted laptop, and my burner phone. I was handed a set of plain gray hospital scrubs and left sitting on the edge of a thin mattress. I was completely isolated. But I was not helpless. A young nurse entered a few minutes later to take my vitals. I recognized her name tag. It was Nurse Hayes, the same charge nurse who had helped me deliver my daughter and initiated the blackout protocol. She looked around the empty room, then looked at me with deep, silent understanding. She knew I was not insane. She had seen me fight through labor with absolute clarity. "Nurse Hayes," I said softly, keeping my voice low. "My mother just filed a false CPS report to steal my child. They took my phone. I need to make one single phone call to secure my defense." Nurse Hayes did not hesitate. She walked over to the door, checked the hallway, and then pulled her personal smartphone from her scrub pocket. She handed it to me, nodding once. "Make it fast," she whispered. I took the phone and rapidly dialed a number I had memorized long ago. It was not the police. It was my husband's personal legal counsel, a man who specialized in aggressive military litigation. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. I sat up straight, a cold smile finally breaking across my face. "Hello, David," I said clearly. "My mother just initiated a fraudulent CPS hold on a military base. I need you here in 10 minutes, and I want you to bring the absolute maximum legal firepower you possess." I handed the smartphone back to Nurse Hayes as the lock clicked. She slipped the device into her pocket and offered a reassuring nod before stepping out. For the next hour, I sat in the silent, windowless room gathering my thoughts and organizing my mental arsenal. I knew exactly what was happening in the administrative offices 2 floors below me. The Child Protective Services investigator, a seasoned woman named Miss Higgins, had arrived on the base. I was not in the room to witness it, but my military attorney David later secured the lobby security footage, and the performance my family put on was nothing short of an Academy Award-winning spectacle. Ashley had sprinted out of St. Jude Hospital the second she realized military police were involved. She arrived at the base in a wheelchair pushed by my mother. To sell the illusion of a woman recovering from labor, Ashley was wearing oversized sweatpants and a highly realistic medical-grade silicone postpartum belly pad under her shirt. She looked exhausted and perfectly cast for the role of the victimized sister. When Miss Higgins approached them in the waiting area, Brenda burst into rehearsed tears. She clutched the investigator's hands, weaving a horrifying narrative about my supposed lifelong battle with severe mental illness. They did not just lie about my current state. They rewrote our family history. Brenda and Ashley systematically projected every single one of Ashley's teenage crimes directly onto me. My mother sat in that lobby and wept as she told the investigator that I was a pathological liar who had failed out of 3 different high schools. She claimed that when I was 17, I had stolen a neighbor's car in a manic episode and crashed it into a ditch, forcing our family to pay tens of thousands of dollars to keep me out of juvenile detention. She painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a troubled girl who had tortured her loving parents for decades. In reality, I was the straight-A student who had secured a full academic scholarship, while Ashley was the one who had totaled the car and dropped out of school. But Miss Higgins did not know that yet. She was looking at a sobbing grandmother and a seemingly exhausted, bleeding mother who claimed her insane sister was trying to kidnap her newborn. Jackson stood in the corner of the lobby during this entire performance, utterly silent. The psychological whiplash of seeing his wife in a wheelchair with a swollen belly, combined with the sheer confidence of their lies, had paralyzed him completely. He was watching his entire reality blur into fiction. By the time Miss Higgins finished taking their preliminary statements, she was fully prepared to walk into a psychiatric ward and interview a highly volatile, dangerous, and deeply delusional woman. She expected screaming, she expected frantic pacing, erratic behavior, and incoherent rambling about conspiracies. The heavy door to my observation room finally opened. 2 military police officers escorted me down the hall to a formal, sterile interrogation room. I was wearing shapeless gray hospital scrubs, my hair was tied back, and I had absolutely no makeup on. I sat down at the cold metal table. A moment later, Miss Higgins walked in, carrying a thick clipboard and wearing an expression of deep professional pity. She sat across from me, sighing heavily as she prepared herself to deal with a severe psychiatric breakdown. "Riley, my name is Miss Higgins." She began, her tone soft and patronizing, the kind of voice you use to speak to a frightened child. "I am here to talk about the events of this evening and to ensure the safety of the infant. I know you are going through a very confusing and difficult time right now. Your mother and sister have explained your medical history to me. I did not break eye contact. I did not fidget, cry, or raise my voice. I sat perfectly upright, my posture rigid, and my breathing completely controlled. The door behind Miss Higgins swung open, and David, my husband's military attorney, strode into the room. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit and carried a large, heavy leather briefcase. He completely ignored the investigator and stood directly by my side, radiating absolute authority. Miss Higgins looked startled by the sudden intrusion. "Excuse me, sir, this is a closed psychiatric evaluation," she stated defensively. "This is a federal legal proceeding," David corrected her, his voice booming in the small room. "And my client is entirely of sound mind." I reached into David's open briefcase. Miss Higgins braced herself for an outburst. Instead, I calmly pulled out a massive, meticulously organized binder filled with color-coded tabs, bank statements, and certified medical records and slid it directly across the metal table toward her. "Before you even open that binder, Miss Higgins," David said, his voice commanding absolute attention, "let me present the foundational document of this entire absurd investigation." He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope bearing the official crest of the United States Department of Defense. He tossed it onto the cold metal table, where it landed with a heavy, authoritative thud right next to my binder. "That is a comprehensive psychological evaluation of my client," David continued. "It was conducted exactly 3 hours ago by the chief of psychiatry for this military installation. Not only does it declare Riley to be in perfect mental health, it specifically notes her exceptional cognitive clarity and emotional regulation under extreme postpartum duress." Miss Higgins blinked, her professional, patronizing demeanor faltering. She reached for the envelope, breaking the seal and scanning the first few pages. As her eyes darted across the official military medical letterhead, the deep frown lines on her forehead began to shift from concern to confusion. "But her mother and sister," she stammered, looking up at me. "They were so adamant. They provided a detailed history of your manic episodes. They said you were a danger to your child. They said exactly what they needed to say to weaponize your agency against me," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "My mother is currently facing a federal felony charge for forging a legal custody document on a military base. Because she failed to steal my child with a fake signature, she pivoted to her backup plan. She called you to do her dirty work." Miss Higgins stiffened, clearly offended by the blunt accusation. "Now listen here, Riley," she started, her tone defensive. "We take allegations of child endangerment incredibly seriously. We do not just act as pawns for family disputes." "Then I suggest you look at the evidence," I said, gesturing toward the thick binder sitting between us. "Because you are currently being used as a pawn in a multi-million-dollar financial fraud conspiracy." I reached into the front pocket of the binder and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I set it gently on the table. "As a data analyst, I know that the best high-end restaurants in this city do not just have video surveillance. They have high-definition audio recording at their premium tables for liability purposes. When my mother abandoned me in active labor at Le Petit Chateau, I did not just call a cab. I immediately texted David to legally secure the surveillance data from our table before the restaurant server systems could overwrite it." David pulled a sleek tablet from his briefcase, inserted the flash drive, and pushed the device across the table toward the investigator. "Press play, Miss Higgins," David instructed coldly. Miss Higgins hesitated for a fraction of a second before tapping the screen. The video flickered to life. The footage was crystal clear, showing our table under the warm glow of the chandelier. The audio was pristine, capturing the clinking of crystal glasses and the soft background music. Then the video showed my water breaking. It showed my face contorted in absolute agony as I begged for help. Miss Higgins watched, her eyes widening in horror as the woman crying in her lobby transformed into the monster on the screen. She watched Brenda look down at her designer shoes with pure disgust. She heard the exact cruel tone of my mother's voice as she threw the $50 bill into my salad. "Call a cab," she snapped on the recording. "I am busy." But it was the next sentence that completely destroyed my mother's web of lies. As I stumbled away from the table on the video, the camera captured Brenda leaning in close to Ashley. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, but the high-definition microphone picked up every single syllable. "Let her take a cab," Brenda hissed, her face twisted with greed. "If she goes to the hospital alone, they will drug her up, and we can easily get the paperwork signed. We need that baby for Jackson's trust fund." The video ended, cutting to a black screen. The silence in the interrogation room was deafening. I sat perfectly still, watching the investigator process the sheer magnitude of the deception. Miss Higgins stared at the blank screen of the tablet. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickening shade of ash gray. Her hands began to tremble as she slowly looked up from the tablet to meet my eyes. She had been sitting in the lobby, comforting a woman who was actively conspiring to traffic a newborn infant for corporate wealth. "This is not a psychiatric crisis," Miss Higgins whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of absolute shock and rising professional fury. "This is a massive criminal conspiracy." David leaned forward, placing his hands firmly on the metal table. "The military police are currently drafting the arrest warrants," he stated. "So unless you want Child Protective Services to be implicated in a federal wire fraud and kidnapping conspiracy, I suggest you conclude your evaluation immediately." Miss Higgins did not hesitate. She aggressively slammed her clipboard shut, clicking her pen with a sharp, violent snap. "The psychiatric hold is completely lifted," she declared, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This case is instantly dismissed." "Let us go get your daughter back, Riley." Miss Higgins marched out of the interrogation room with David and the military police officers right behind her. I followed closely, my heart pounding with a fierce mixture of adrenaline and overwhelming relief. Within 15 minutes, the nightmare was over. The pediatric nurses brought my daughter back to me. I sat in a private recovery suite, holding her warm, tiny body against my chest, breathing in the sweet scent of her skin. The heavy iron grip of fear that had choked me for hours finally released. But the battle was far from over. Downstairs in the hospital lobby, the reality of the situation was crashing down on my mother and sister. David had handed the surveillance footage over to the federal authorities. The military police approached the waiting area with handcuffs ready to arrest Brenda for filing a false federal report and forging medical documents. Ashley saw the armed guards marching toward them and realized her fake pregnancy and their malicious conspiracy were about to end in a prison cell. Because she was a true sociopath, she did not confess or apologize. She played her most manipulative and dangerous card yet. As the officer stepped into the lobby, Ashley suddenly stood up from her wheelchair. She let out a blood-curdling theatrical scream and sprinted toward the automatic sliding glass doors. Jackson yelled her name, chasing after her in absolute panic. Ashley burst into the rainy hospital parking lot. Instead of running away, she violently threw herself onto the wet pavement, right in the path of an oncoming, slow-moving hospital transport shuttle. The shuttle slammed on its brakes, stopping inches from her, but Ashley writhed on the ground, gasping for air and clutching her chest. She screamed that her life was over, that the grief of losing her baby was too much to bear, and that she had swallowed a handful of stolen prescription pills in the bathroom to end her own life. It was a completely fabricated suicide attempt, designed entirely to weaponize Jackson's empathy and halt the impending arrests. And it worked perfectly. The military police were forced to pivot from an arrest protocol to a critical medical emergency. Paramedics rushed out, loaded Ashley onto a stretcher, and wheeled her into the civilian trauma center across the street. Jackson was instantly pulled back into her toxic orbit, trapped by the overwhelming guilt and terror of watching his wife attempt to take her own life. Because Jackson was the high-profile chief executive officer of a massive health tech company, the chaos in the parking lot did not stay quiet. Within 2 hours, local news vans were parked outside the hospital. By morning, the story had been picked up by national financial blogs and gossip sites. The headlines were a public relations nightmare. Prominent tech executive wife rushed to trauma center following tragic pregnancy complications and alleged suicide attempt. The media spun a devastating narrative about a grieving mother pushed to the brink. The corporate fallout was immediate and brutal. Jackson's tech company was preparing for a major software launch, and investors panicked sold their shares. The company's stock wobbled, dipping 6% by the time the market opened. Shareholders demanded answers, and Jackson was trapped in a civilian hospital room, sitting beside a woman who was hooked up to saline drips and faking a catatonic depressive state. He could not leave her without looking like a monster to the press, and he could not divorce her while she was supposedly on suicide watch. Ashley had successfully built a fortress out of her own fabricated tragedy. I sat in my secure room watching the news coverage stream across the screen of my returned encrypted laptop. My daughter was sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside me, safe behind military-grade security. But as I watched the reporters dissect Jackson's personal life and saw my mother giving a tearful, anonymous quote to a tabloid magazine, a cold, hard truth settled into my bones. Defending myself was no longer enough. I had successfully protected my child and cleared my name, but Brenda and Ashley were still out there manipulating the narrative and destroying Jackson's life. They had weaponized the media, the legal system, and the fundamental goodness of the people around them. As long as they possessed any social standing or financial leverage, they would never stop coming for me. They would never stop lying. I closed my laptop, feeling a new, terrifying sense of calm wash over me. I did not just need to build a higher wall. I needed to burn their entire kingdom to the ground. I had to go on the offensive. 2 days after I was officially discharged from the military hospital, I was sitting in the quiet sanctuary of my own living room. My daughter was asleep in her bassinet nearby. Ryan and I had spent hours on a secure video call discussing the situation, and he had immediately doubled the private security patrol around our property. The media storm surrounding Jackson and Ashley was still raging outside, but inside my home the air was completely still. It was approaching midnight when the motion sensor alert chimed softly on my security tablet. I pulled up the front porch camera and saw a solitary figure standing in the freezing rain. It was Jackson. I unlocked the heavy deadbolts and pulled the front door open. Jackson stood on my porch looking like a hollow shell of the confident tech executive he used to be. His expensive wool coat was soaked through and his shoulders were hunched against the biting cold. I did not say a single word. I simply stepped aside and let him walk into the warm entryway. He stood there dripping water onto the hardwood floor, completely ignoring the chill. He looked at me, and the last remaining shred of his pride finally shattered. "Riley, I am so incredibly sorry," Jackson said, his voice cracking with raw exhaustion. "I am so sorry I ever doubted you in that hospital room. I was weak and I let them manipulate my desperate desire to be a father. I should have stood by you when your mother brought out that forged document." I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "How is your wife, Jackson?" I asked, my tone perfectly neutral. Jackson let out a bitter, hollow laugh that held absolutely no joy. "She is perfectly fine," he replied, shaking his head in profound disgust. I sat by her bed in the trauma center for 2 agonizing days, while the media dragged my company through the mud. The doctors ran a comprehensive toxicology panel on her. There was absolutely nothing in her system. She did not swallow a single pill. It was a complete performance designed entirely to trap me in that room and stop the military police from arresting her and your mother. And the worst part is she laid there in that hospital bed crying about our lost baby, knowing I was sitting right beside her, carrying the agonizing weight of her lies. He looked up at me, his eyes red and bloodshot. "I cannot do this anymore, Riley," he pleaded. "I cannot just hand her divorce papers and walk away. If I try to leave her quietly, she will drag my name through family court. She will use the media to claim I abandoned my suicidal wife after a tragic pregnancy loss. She will destroy my company and my reputation while playing the ultimate victim. I know you understand data. I know you understand how to find the truth. I am begging you to help me take them down." I stared at him, letting the heavy silence stretch between us. I thought about the sheer terror I felt when my mother called Child Protective Services. I thought about the terrifying reality that they were willing to strip me of my newborn child just to secure a trust fund. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "I will help you. Jackson, I finally said, my voice cold and absolute. But if we do this, we do it my way. I am establishing a very firm boundary right now. I do not want a quiet divorce for you. I do not want sealed court records or private financial settlements hidden behind non-disclosure agreements. They tried to steal my daughter and lock me in a psychiatric ward. If I am going to dismantle their lives, I want a public, humiliating execution of their entire social standing. I want every single person in their wealthy elite circle to see exactly who they really are. I want them left with absolutely nothing. Jackson did not flinch. The sorrow in his eyes slowly hardened into a sharp, cold determination. He nodded once, accepting the ruthless terms of my agreement. He reached into the inner pocket of his wet coat and pulled out a small black flash drive along with a folded piece of paper. He held them out to me. Ashley has always been careless with her digital security, Jackson said, his voice dropping to a low, steady whisper. She uses the same passwords for everything. This piece of paper has the master login for her entire iCloud account, including every text message and deleted photo she has sent for the last 3 years. And the flash drive contains the complete routing numbers and access portals for the offshore financial accounts Brenda forced me to set up for her under my company umbrella. I am giving you full, unrestricted access to everything. I reached out and took the flash drive and the paper from his hand. The metal of the drive was cold against my palm. I looked down at the keys to their absolute destruction and felt that terrifying calm settle over me once again. The pact was sealed. The moment Jackson stepped back out into the freezing rain, I locked the heavy deadbolt and walked straight into my home office. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop as I plugged the small black flash drive into the USB port. A prompt appeared asking for a decryption key. I unfolded the damp piece of paper Jackson had given me and typed in the master password. The drive opened, revealing a massive directory of folders, spreadsheets, and offshore banking portals. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. As a medical data analyst, my entire professional career revolves around finding hidden anomalies in endless seas of numbers. I routinely hunt for billing fraud, phantom clinics, and missing medical inventory. Tracking down my mother's deeply buried financial secrets used the exact same technical skill set. I ran a custom script to compile the routing numbers across all the different bank statements. I watched closely as lines of code rapidly populated my screen, cross-referencing deposits and withdrawals over the last 3 years. I expected to find extreme vanity purchases. I expected to see maxed-out luxury credit cards and designer bags. What I found was a financial crater so massive it took my breath away. I started with the oldest records on the drive. Deep in a subfolder labeled Historical, I found a scanned copy of a bank ledger from nearly a decade ago. It was the massive payout from my late father's life insurance policy. When he passed away, that money was legally supposed to be placed into a secure trust for Ashley and me to use for our college education. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold, as I traced the digital footprint of that money. Within 24 months of my father's funeral, Brenda had completely drained the account. Every single cent was gone. She had forged my signature to bypass the trust restrictions and funneled the cash into her personal checking account. But the stolen life insurance was just the beginning of her black hole. I opened the files linked to Jackson's tech company. Jackson had generously set up a corporate umbrella account to manage Ashley's extravagant living expenses and pay for my mother's estate maintenance. Brenda had been the primary signatory on that account. Over the past 12 months, the withdrawal velocity had violently skyrocketed. She was siphoning tens of thousands of dollars every single week, using generic memo lines like medical consulting and emergency estate repairs. It was a relentless, desperate bleed of Jackson's wealth. I needed to know exactly where the money was bleeding out. I pulled up an IP tracker and began tracing the offshore wire transfers. The funds did not stay in local banks. They were being bounced through a highly sophisticated digital laundering scheme. The money moved from Jackson's corporate umbrella to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, then fractured into dozens of smaller crypto wallets before finally reassembling in a private offshore account based in Nevada. I ran the Nevada routing number through a specialized financial threat database I occasionally used for hospital security checks. The system flagged the account with a flashing bright red warning banner. The offshore account was a known front for a notorious underground casino network operating out of Las Vegas. It was heavily linked to a violent syndicate of the Russian mafia. I leaned back in my desk chair, the glowing monitor reflecting in my wide eyes. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, painting a terrifying picture of my mother's reality. Brenda was not just a greedy narcissist trying to maintain her country club status. She was a degenerate, high-stakes gambler drowning in a catastrophic ocean of illegal debt. She had gambled away my father's life insurance years ago, and when that well ran dry, she turned her sights on Jackson's tech fortune. The sudden spike in her massive withdrawals aligned perfectly with the exact month Jackson had first handed Ashley divorce papers. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Ashley faking her pregnancy was never just about keeping her husband or preserving her luxury lifestyle. It was a desperate, calculated survival tactic for our mother. If Jackson finalized the divorce, the offshore wire transfers would immediately stop. Brenda would lose her personal billionaire ATM, and if the money stopped flowing to Las Vegas, those underground bookies would not just send polite collection letters. They would send violent men to break her legs. The baby they tried to steal from me was never meant to be loved. My daughter was simply a financial instrument. She was the ultimate collateral designed to lock Jackson in permanently before the Las Vegas bookies broke my mother's legs. I showed Jackson the offshore routing numbers the next morning. He sat at my kitchen island staring at the screen as the final pieces of his fractured reality fell into place. The devastating truth that his entire marriage was funding a violent underground syndicate completely extinguished any lingering trace of sympathy he had left for his wife. The shivering man from my porch vanished. In his place sat a calculating executive ready to dismantle the parasites who drained his life. We began quietly preparing our strike, but we underestimated the sheer boundless audacity of Ashley. 48 hours after her fake suicide attempt, Ashley was discharged from the trauma center. A normal person would have quickly gone into hiding. A person with an ounce of shame would have laid low, fearing the impending military police investigation. But Ashley was a textbook narcissist. Her ego required constant validation, and the media attention surrounding her hospital stay had given her the ultimate high. She refused to let the momentum die. Jackson received the notification on his phone while sitting in my living room. He stared at the screen, his jaw clenching so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "She is actually doing it," Jackson whispered, handing the phone to me. "She is going forward with the sip and see." I looked at the digital invitation. It was a lavish evite sent to over 200 of Jackson's wealthiest friends and board members. A sip and see is a traditional high society gathering hosted after a birth to introduce the new baby to the community. It was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday afternoon at Jackson's sprawling estate. But how does she plan to host a baby viewing party without a baby? I asked my analytical mind, trying to process the absolute insanity of her strategy. I scrolled down to the fine print on the invitation, and my stomach churned with pure disgust. Ashley had spun a masterful, tragic narrative. She wrote that due to her traumatic labor, the baby was born extremely premature. She claimed her beautiful newborn was currently fighting for its life in a highly restricted neonatal intensive care unit and could not be brought home for several months. She invited everyone to gather at the estate to support her and Jackson during this devastating time. And then came the grift. At the bottom of the invitation was a link to a private secure portal for a NICU medical fund. She was asking for cash donations. She claimed the specialized treatments were astronomical, and she wanted to build a financial safety net for the child's future care. "She is weaponizing the sympathy of my entire corporate network," Jackson said, his voice shaking with fresh anger. "My investors will easily drop $10,000 each to show full support. She is going to collect hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and untraceable gifts under the guise of saving a phantom child." She is using my reputation to fund your mother's gambling syndicate right out in the open. Jackson paced the length of my living room. I have to shut it down, he declared, pulling out his phone. I will send a mass email right now. I will tell them the event is canceled due to a family emergency. I will freeze the bank accounts. I cannot let her steal from my friends and colleagues. I stepped directly in his path, forcing him to stop pacing. I reached out and gently pushed his phone down. No, Jackson, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, steady whisper. Do not cancel a single thing. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Riley, she's about to commit massive financial fraud in my own home. Exactly, I replied, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. She is about to commit wire fraud, charity fraud, and grand larceny in front of 200 elite witnesses. If you cancel the party now, she will just spin another lie. She will tell everyone you are a cruel, abusive husband who abandoned her in her darkest hour. She will use the cancellation to solicit private donations behind your back. We cannot fight shadows, Jackson. We have to completely drag them out into the blinding light. I walked back to my laptop and tapped the bright glowing screen. Let her host the party, Jackson, I instructed. Let her put on the designer dress. Let her hire the best caterers and pour the vintage champagne. Let her stand in front of your entire network and collect those cash envelopes. We need her to feel completely victorious. We want her comfortable, because the higher she builds her own magnificent pedestal, the more devastating it will be when we kick it out from under her. Saturday afternoon arrived with perfectly clear skies and a gentle breeze. Jackson's massive stone estate sat on 10 acres of manicured land nestled in the wealthiest zip code of the state. The long, circular driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts hurried back and forth while a string quartet played elegant classical music on the sprawling back patio. Jackson had spared absolutely no expense for the catering. Waiters walked through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate caviar appetizers. It looked like a scene pulled directly from a luxury lifestyle magazine. But beneath the glittering surface of the champagne and the beautiful floral arrangements, the absolute moral rot of my family was on full display. I was not in the room yet. Jackson had hired a private security team to position me discreetly in a side hallway out of sight. I watched the entire sickening spectacle unfold through a secure live feed on a tablet connected to the estate security cameras. Ashley was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She stood near the massive marble fireplace in the center of the grand ballroom, wearing a breathtaking pale blue designer gown. She looked perfectly styled, with her hair pinned back in an elegant twist and her makeup applied to make her look just the right amount of exhausted. She was surrounded by a circle of Jackson's wealthiest board members and their wives. Through the audio feed, I could hear her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. She dabbed her dry eyes with a monogrammed lace handkerchief. It is just so incredibly hard, she told the wife of a prominent venture capitalist. She is so tiny. The doctors say she is a fighter, but every time I have to leave the neonatal intensive care unit, my heart completely breaks. I just want to bring my baby girl home. The women around her cooed in sympathy, touching her arm and offering words of profound comfort. They were entirely captivated by her tragic narrative. They had absolutely no idea they were comforting a woman wearing a corset under her designer gown who had spent the morning drinking mimosas while the caterers set up. Ashley had spent her entire life chasing this exact level of elite social validation. Growing up, she had always resented anyone who had more than her. Now she was standing in the center of a billionaire social circle, soaking up their undivided attention and exploiting their genuine human empathy for her own twisted gratification. While Ashley handled the emotional manipulation, my mother was efficiently managing the financial extraction. Brenda hovered near a long oak table set up by the entrance. The table was draped in white silk and covered in expensive baby gifts. But Brenda was not interested in the stuffed animals or the designer baby blankets. She was entirely focused on the small, discreet box designated for the medical fund. As guests arrived, they walked up to Brenda, offering their deepest condolences and handing her thick white envelopes. These were not modest gifts. These were wealthy executives dropping $5,000 and $10,000 checks and stacks of $100 bills. Brenda accepted every single envelope with a tragic sigh and a solemn nod of gratitude. But she was not even putting them into the designated collection box. I watched the camera feed in utter disgust as she casually slipped envelope after envelope directly into her oversized luxury handbag. She was literally pocketing the cash right in front of them, knowing it would be wired straight to the Las Vegas Mafia by the end of the weekend. Jackson was standing near the grand staircase holding a glass of scotch he had not tasted. He was playing his part perfectly, but I could see the tight clench of his jaw and the rigid tension in his broad shoulders. He was nodding politely as a software developer offered his sympathies, but Jackson's eyes kept darting toward the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom. He was watching his corporate network, his friends and his mentors, being systematically robbed by the two women he had allowed into his home. The sheer brazenness of their grift was almost impossible to witness. They were so incredibly confident in their lies. They truly believed they were invincible. The string quartet shifted to a lively, upbeat tempo, attempting to lighten the somber mood in the room. Ashley let out a delicate, highly practiced laugh at something a guest said, resting her hand gently on her flat stomach. Brenda zipped her heavy designer purse shut, having successfully collected tens of thousands of dollars in illicit funds. The trap was fully loaded. The pedestals were built as high as they could possibly go. Jackson looked up and caught the eye of his head of security standing near the entrance. Jackson gave one single subtle nod. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. Every single eye in the massive room turned toward the entrance, expecting to see the caterers bringing out the next round of expensive appetizers. Instead, they saw me. I did not look like the severely mentally ill, hysterical woman my mother and sister had spent the entire week describing to anyone who would listen. I did not look like a grieving sister who had suffered a tragic psychotic break. I looked absolutely flawless. I was wearing a razor-sharp midnight blue designer suit perfectly tailored to my frame. My hair was styled in sleek waves, falling effortlessly over my shoulders. And nestled securely against my chest, wrapped in a simple, elegant white blanket, was my perfectly healthy, living, breathing baby girl. The lively classical music screeching to a halt was the only sound that pierced the sudden suffocating silence of the ballroom. The cellist actually dropped his bow in shock. 200 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city stood completely frozen, gripping their crystal champagne flutes and staring at me. They had just spent the last hour weeping over a phantom premature infant fighting for its life in an intensive care unit and handing over thick envelopes of cash to support a grieving mother. Now they were looking directly at the very real, very healthy child my family had tried to steal and erase from existence. The color drained so rapidly from my mother's face that I thought she might actually collapse right there by the gift table. Her manicured hands shook violently, dropping the oversized luxury handbag filled with stolen cash. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy thud, but she did not even notice. For a split second, genuine unfiltered terror flashed in her eyes, but then her desperate narcissistic need to control the narrative kicked into overdrive. She sprinted across the ballroom floor, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the wood, desperately trying to intercept me before I could walk further into the crowd. "What are you doing here?" Brenda hissed, her voice kept in a tight, venomous whisper as she stepped directly into my path, attempting to physically block me from the view of the elite guests. "You need to turn around and leave right this second, Riley. How did you even get past the front security gate? You are trespassing on private property, and if you do not walk out that door immediately, I am calling the police and having you arrested for harassment. You are sick. You belong in a locked hospital ward." I did not stop walking. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. I simply kept my gaze fixed forward, forcing her to stumble backward in her heels to avoid colliding with me. "You are not calling anyone mother," I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the dead silent room, carrying just enough volume for the front row of guests to hear every word. "Jackson invited me. This is his house. and I thought it was only appropriate that I bring the guest of honor to her own sip-and-see party. Across the room, standing by the grand marble fireplace, Ashley realized her perfectly constructed world was collapsing in real time. Her eyes darted wildly from my calm face to the healthy newborn in my arms, and then to the confused, horrified faces of the wealthy investors surrounding her. The narrative of her tragic premature labor was instantly destroyed just by my physical presence. She could not lie her way out of this with words. The physical evidence was literally breathing in my arms. She needed a massive distraction. She needed to instantly redirect the sympathy of the room back to her before anyone started asking questions. Ashley let out a loud, piercing gasp that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. She pressed the back of her hand to her forehead, swaying dramatically on her feet. "Oh, my chest!" she cried out, her voice fluttering with fake weakness. "The stress is too much for my fragile heart." She closed her eyes and let her knees buckle, executing a flawless theatrical feint directly toward the hard marble hearth. A chorus of panicked gasps erupted from the elite guests. Several people lunged forward to help the supposedly fragile recovering mother, but Jackson was standing right next to her. With lightning-fast reflexes, Jackson reached out and caught Ashley securely by the waist just before she hit the floor. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, praising the attentive, devoted husband. Ashley kept her eyes squeezed shut, resting her head against his chest, waiting for him to gently lower her to the ground and loudly call for a doctor. But Jackson did not call for a doctor. He did not ask if she was okay. He looked down at the woman who had manipulated him, lied about a pregnancy, faked a suicide attempt, and used his friends to fund a mafia gambling syndicate. A look of pure, unadulterated disgust washed over his face. He simply opened his arms, stepped back, and dropped her straight onto the hardwood. The heavy thud of Ashley's body hitting the solid hardwood floor echoed like a gunshot. Several wealthy women screamed, dropping their crystal champagne flutes. Delicate glass shattered, sending alcohol pooling around Ashley's expensive designer gown. People rushed forward, expecting Jackson to drop to his knees and beg for a doctor. Instead, Jackson calmly stepped over her perfectly styled hair. He did not look back. He did not offer a single word of comfort. His face was a mask of cold resolve as he marched toward the DJ booth at the far end of the room. Ashley cracked one eye open, realizing her dramatic feint had failed. She scrambled to sit up, abandoning her fragile act entirely. Her face flushed with panic as she looked around at the bewildered faces of the wealthy elite who were staring at her miraculous recovery with deep suspicion. Before she could formulate a new lie, Jackson reached the booth. He grabbed the microphone and slammed his hand down on the master power switch of the mixing board. The classical music died instantly, leaving behind a suffocating, heavy silence. Jackson looked out over the sea of confused faces. "Thank you all for coming today," he said, his deep voice booming through the speakers. "You were invited here under the pretense of supporting a grieving mother. You were told my wife suffered a traumatic premature labor, and you generously donated your hard-earned money to save a child fighting for its life. I am standing here right now to tell you that every word you were told today was an absolute lie meant to exploit your kindness." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the ballroom. Brenda, who was standing near the gift table clutching her empty designer purse, went entirely rigid. She looked frantically toward the exit, but private security guards had already locked the oak doors, preventing any escape. "I apologize for bringing you into this," Jackson continued, his voice unwavering. "You were actively being defrauded in my own home, and I refuse to let that happen. Let me show you who you have been giving your sympathy and money to today." Jackson pressed a button on the AV panel. A motorized projection screen used for corporate presentations silently lowered from the vaulted ceiling covering the back wall of the ballroom. A high-definition projector flickered to life, casting a bright beam of light over the crowd. The screen illuminated with the security footage from Le Petit Chateau. The guests watched in confusion as the restaurant scene played out above them. Then the pristine audio kicked in. They heard my sharp, agonizing gasp as my water broke. They watched my face contort in terror as I begged my mother for help. The collective horror in the ballroom was palpable. 200 influential people watched Brenda look down at her shoes with pure disgust. They heard her cold, venomous voice echo through the speakers. "Call a cab," she snapped on the recording. "I am busy." Guests physically recoiled, looking at Brenda with sheer disgust. The woman weeping about family loyalty was exposed as a monster abandoning her pregnant daughter. As I stumbled away on the screen, the camera zoomed in and the microphone caught the final devastating whisper. "Let her take a cab," Brenda hissed to Ashley on the screen. "If she goes to the hospital alone, they will drug her up and we can easily get the paperwork signed. We need that baby for Jackson's trust fund." The ballroom erupted. Outraged whispers turned into angry shouts. The venture capitalist wife who had been comforting Ashley stepped away from her as if she were radioactive. Brenda realized her social empire had just been incinerated in front of her eyes. She frantically waved her hands, her face turning a violent crimson. "It is a lie!" Brenda screamed over the chaotic noise of the crowd, her voice cracking with desperate panic. She pointed a shaking finger at the giant screen. "Do not believe a single word of it. That video is entirely fabricated. It is an AI deepfake. Riley works with data. She manipulated the audio to frame me because she is insanely jealous of her sister. She is a psychotic liar trying to ruin us." I gently handed my sleeping daughter to Jackson's trusted head of security, who stepped out from the shadows. I walked smoothly across the polished hardwood floor, my designer heels clicking with absolute authority, until I reached the elevated DJ booth. Jackson stepped aside, handing me the microphone. I looked out at my mother, watching the frantic terror consuming her eyes. "You think I faked that video?" I said, my voice perfectly calm, slicing through the angry murmurs of the crowd. "Fine. Let us look at some real medical records then, shall we?" I calmly turned back to the mixing board and firmly plugged the black flash drive Jackson had given me into the main console laptop. My fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. "Let me be entirely clear," I announced, my voice projecting over the panicked whispers of the crowd. "I am a professional medical data analyst. I do not forge documents, and I do not make accusations without absolute irrefutable proof. What I am about to show you was legally obtained by the primary policyholder of Ashley's health insurance, which happens to be her husband, Jackson." I clicked the final file. The security video of the restaurant vanished from the massive projection screen. In its place, a stark white medical document appeared. It was an official surgical summary report from a highly respected private clinic in downtown Chicago. The header clearly displayed Ashley's full legal name, her date of birth, and her patient identification number. Ashley scrambled to her feet, her designer gown now stained with spilled champagne. She stared at the screen, her eyes widening in absolute horror. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the glaring truth illuminated above her. "I want everyone to direct their attention to the highlighted section in the middle of the page," I instructed, my voice steady and commanding. "This is a surgical operative report dated exactly 5 years ago. 5 years before she supposedly conceived the child you are all gathered here to celebrate." I paused, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, before delivering the absolute killing blow. 5 years ago, Ashley voluntarily underwent a bilateral salpingectomy, I stated clearly, translating the medical jargon for the room. For those who do not know the terminology, that means she had both of her fallopian tubes completely and permanently removed. It is an absolute permanent sterilization. I looked directly at my sister, who was now trembling violently. "Ashley is entirely medically incapable of getting pregnant," I declared. "There was no miracle pregnancy, there was no traumatic premature labor, and there is absolutely no baby fighting for its life in a neonatal intensive care unit right now. She wore a silicone belly pad for 9 months and used all of you to fund my mother's illegal gambling debts." The ballroom completely exploded. The polite, shocked murmurs instantly transformed into a chaotic uproar of absolute outrage. 200 of the most powerful people in the city realized they had been played for absolute fools. Wives of board members who had just wept over Ashley's fake tragedy began shouting in pure disgust. A wealthy venture capitalist who had personally handed Brenda a check for $20,000 stormed toward the gift table demanding his money back. Brenda was entirely surrounded by furious guests. She backed against the wall, hyperventilating, unable to formulate a single lie to save herself. The physical evidence on the screen was undeniable. The registry codes, the surgical timestamps, and the attending physician signatures were all perfectly verified. The flawless pedestal they had spent months building had just been violently pulverized into dust. Ashley covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically. But this time her tears were real. They were not tears of sorrow or guilt. They were tears of absolute narcissistic collapse. Her entire social empire, her wealth, her reputation, and her perfectly crafted victim narrative were completely obliterated in front of the exact audience she craved the most. She looked up through her fingers, desperately searching for the one person who had always saved her. "Jackson," she wailed, taking a pathetic, stumbling step toward him. "Jackson, please, you have to listen to me. I did it because I loved you. I was completely terrified that you were going to pack your bags and leave me forever." Jackson did not flinch. He did not look at her with an ounce of pity. He walked slowly across the chaotic ballroom floor, the furious crowd naturally parting to let him through. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from the woman he had called his wife. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out a thick manila envelope. Ashley reached her shaking hands out toward him, truly hoping he was offering her a final lifeline. Instead, Jackson slapped the heavy envelope directly against her chest, forcing her to grab it before it fell. "I am not saving you," Jackson said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying register that cut right through her. "That envelope contains an ironclad divorce filing. It cites extreme financial fraud, criminal conspiracy, and deliberate emotional abuse. My legal team has already frozen every single one of your credit cards and locked you out of all joint accounts. You have absolutely nothing left in this world." Jackson turned his back on Ashley, leaving her clutching the thick manila envelope against her stained designer gown. The sound of her pathetic, hyperventilating sobs filled the empty space around her, but I was not finished. The medical truth had severed her parasitic grip on Jackson, but the financial truth was about to send my mother to a federal penitentiary. I stepped closer to the edge of the DJ booth, gripping the microphone tightly. I looked directly at the long oak table where the mountain of expensive gifts sat neglected. Then I locked eyes with the wealthy guests standing near the front of the crowd. "If any of you walked into this estate today and handed my mother a thick white envelope, I need you to direct your attention back to the projection screen," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority. I tapped the spacebar on the mixing board laptop. The surgical report vanished. In its place, a massive, complex spreadsheet illuminated the ballroom wall. It was filled with highlighted rows, offshore routing numbers, and glaring red flags. "You were told your generous cash donations were going into a secure medical fund to save a premature infant in the neonatal intensive care unit." I continued, pacing slowly across the elevated platform. "You thought you were funding life-saving treatments. Let me show you exactly where your money was destined to go by the end of this weekend." I clicked another file, bringing up the digital laundering schematic I had uncovered. The screen displayed a clear, undeniable flow of money. It showed transfers moving from Jackson's corporate umbrella account to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, and finally dropping into a private offshore account based in Nevada. "My mother Brenda does not care about sick children," I declared, pointing at the glowing red terminal code on the screen. "She is a degenerate high-stakes gambler who is currently drowning in a catastrophic ocean of illegal debt. She gambled away my late father's life insurance years ago. When that money ran out, she set her sights on Jackson's tech fortune. But Jackson recently filed for divorce, which meant her billionaire ATM was about to be permanently shut down." The guests stared at the screen, their mouths hanging open, as the sheer scale of the deception washed over them. "This fake pregnancy was never just about saving a failing marriage," I explained, my voice turning incredibly cold. "It was a calculated, desperate survival tactic. My mother owes hundreds of thousands of dollars to an underground casino network operated by a violent syndicate in Las Vegas. If the money stopped flowing, those bookies were going to send men to break her legs." She used my sister to fake a pregnancy to trap Jackson. When I went into labor, she tried to steal my newborn to use as a permanent financial hostage. And today, she used your genuine human empathy to collect cash right in front of your eyes. Every single dollar you put into that collection box today was going straight to the Russian mafia to pay off her gambling debts. The silence that followed was heavy thick with the terrifying realization of how deeply these elite guests had been manipulated. They were not just scammed, they were unknowingly made accomplices in an illegal money laundering operation. The wealthy venture capitalist who had confronted Brenda earlier stepped forward, his face purple with absolute fury. He pointed a shaking finger at Brenda, who was cowering against the wall. "That is wire fraud," he shouted, his voice echoing like thunder across the ballroom. "That is federal charity fraud and grand larceny." The words triggered a massive shockwave. Other guests began to shout, demanding the police be called immediately. They cornered Brenda, their expensive suits and designer dresses pressing in on her from all sides. The pristine, untouchable social empire she had sacrificed her own daughter to build was actively tearing her to pieces. Brenda looked at the angry mob surrounding her, then looked up at me standing on the elevated booth. Her mind could not process the total catastrophic failure of her reality. The narcissistic delusion shattered completely, leaving behind nothing but pure, unhinged, animalistic rage. Her eyes rolled back with sheer madness. She let out a guttural, terrifying screech that sounded entirely inhuman. She broke through the circle of furious guests, her expensive heels slipping on the spilled champagne, and lunged directly toward the DJ booth. She was not trying to escape. She was aiming straight for me, her clawed hands reaching out violently, desperately trying to rip my sleeping baby right out of my arms. Brenda was entirely feral. Her hands curled into claws, aiming directly for the blanket wrapped tightly against my chest. I did not flinch or take a step backward. I did not need to. Before her manicured fingers could even graze the fabric of my suit, a dark blur intercepted her path. Jackson moved with a speed and ferocity I had never seen from him before. He grabbed Brenda by the shoulders mid-lunge, his large hands locking onto her silk dress like a vice. With a powerful shove, he threw her backward. Brenda stumbled wildly, her expensive heels catching on the edge of the elevated platform. She crashed hard onto the polished hardwood floor, landing in a tangled mess of silk and spilled champagne right next to where Ashley was still shivering and sobbing. "Stay away from them," Jackson roared, his voice echoing like thunder across the massive ballroom. "Do not ever try to touch her or that child again." His chest heaved as he stood between the DJ booth and the two women on the floor, forming an impenetrable physical barrier. He was no longer the confused, heartbroken husband. He was a man who had completely severed the toxic ties that bound him, and he was actively protecting the only real family he had left. Brenda gasped for air, trying to push herself up. Her perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess and her face was stained with smeared mascara. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Jackson. "You owe us. We gave you everything." Jackson looked down at her with absolute cold indifference. "You gave me a nightmare," he replied, chillingly calm, "and I am waking up." Right as the words left his mouth, a sudden intense array of flashing red and blue lights pierced the darkness outside. The bright strobes swept across the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, casting long, frantic shadows over the terrified faces of the wealthy guests. The deafening wail of police sirens grew louder and louder until it felt like it was shaking the very foundations of the mansion. Tires screeched violently on the circular driveway, stopping directly in front of the grand entrance. Jackson turned his head slightly, looking back at me with a nod of absolute solidarity. He had not just frozen the bank accounts. The moment I showed him the offshore routing numbers on my laptop, he quietly handed my entire encrypted financial dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the local organized crime fraud units. The trap was not just a social humiliation, it was a perfectly executed legal guillotine. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were suddenly pushed open from the outside. The private security team Jackson had hired immediately stepped aside, lowering their heads in compliance. A dozen armed federal agents stormed into the grand room. They wore dark, tactical windbreakers with large yellow letters spelling out FBI across the back. The stark contrast of their heavy combat boots marching across the pristine marble floors of the high society estate was surreal. The wealthy venture capitalists instantly backed away, parting like the Red Sea to give the federal agents a clear path. Nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire of a massive money laundering bust. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, zeroed in directly on the two women sitting on the floor. "Secure the perimeter," he barked into his radio before pointing firmly at my mother and sister. "Brenda and Ashley Wilson, do not move a single muscle." Ashley began screaming hysterically, scrambling backward like a cornered animal until her back hit the marble fireplace. "I did not do anything," she wailed, her designer gown soaking up the dirty champagne. "It was all her idea. My mother made me do it. I am the victim." Brenda stared at her golden child in absolute shock, betrayed by the very daughter she had sacrificed everything to protect. But the federal agents did not care about their pathetic family dynamics. Two agents grabbed Brenda by the arms, hoisting her roughly to her feet. Another pair hauled Ashley up, pinning her arms behind her back. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead agent declared, his voice echoing over the chaotic sobbing. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping securely around their wrists was the loudest sound in the room. They were aggressively restrained in their glamorous evening gowns, their pristine social masks completely destroyed. I looked out over the massive ballroom, watching true justice unfold. 200 influential guests did not dare to look away. Instead, every single person pulled out their smartphone. Camera flashes fired rapidly, illuminating the room as the wealthy elite recorded every single agonizing second of the absolute humiliation. The federal agents practically dragged my mother and sister through the grand foyer of the sprawling estate. Ashley was sobbing hysterically, her expensive designer gown ruined by spilled champagne and the harsh grip of the arresting officers. She begged the wealthy guests to help her, pleading for someone to call her a lawyer, but the elite crowd simply backed away in absolute disgust. Brenda was completely silent now. Her face was frozen in a mask of pale, absolute defeat, as the narcissistic delusion finally broke under the weight of federal handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the heavy rain pouring outside as the massive oak doors were thrown wide open. The guests followed closely behind their smartphone cameras, still recording the spectacular, unmitigated collapse of the Wilson women. As the agents pushed them down the front stone steps toward the waiting police cruisers, a massive black military SUV cut sharply through the line of emergency vehicles. It parked aggressively right in the center of the circular driveway, the heavy engine rumbling loudly over the sound of the rain. The thick armored door swung open. Ryan stepped out into the freezing downpour. He was wearing his immaculate full military dress uniform, his chest adorned with medals, reflecting the flashing police lights. He had called in every single favor he possessed to secure an emergency combat leave, the absolute second David informed him about the fraudulent Child Protective Services report. Ryan did not say a single word to the federal agents. He simply stood there, a towering wall of absolute protective fury, and locked his eyes directly onto my mother. Brenda looked up at the man she had constantly belittled and mocked for his public service. The sheer terror in her eyes magnified 100 times over as she realized the true unyielding power of the family she had foolishly tried to destroy. Ryan maintained that cold, lethal stare until a federal agent shoved Brenda roughly into the back of the cruiser and slammed the heavy door shut. The moment the police cars pulled away, his entire fierce demeanor softened completely. He ran up the wet stone steps, completely ignoring the whispering crowd, and wrapped his strong arms entirely around me and our daughter. I buried my face into his warm shoulder, finally letting out a long, shuddering breath. The war was officially over. 6 months passed rapidly, replacing the chaotic nightmare of that week with a deep, permanent peace. The federal justice system moved with ruthless, unforgiving efficiency. Brenda pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement, just to avoid a 20-year maximum trial sentence. She was currently sitting in a high-security federal penitentiary serving a mandatory 5-year term. There were no designer handbags, no vintage champagne, and no high society luncheons behind those walls. She traded her exclusive country club membership for a concrete cell and a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The Russian syndicate completely cut their losses, leaving her entirely isolated and abandoned. Ashley fared no better. Jackson executed the divorce with clinical, devastating precision. Because his legal team invoked an ironclad extreme fraud clause hidden deep within their prenuptial agreement, Ashley was legally stripped of absolutely everything. She walked away from the marriage with zero alimony, zero assets, and a towering mountain of legal debt. The former high society elite was now working a grueling minimum wage retail job in a suburban strip mall, spending every single meager paycheck trying to pay off the ruthless defense attorneys who had barely kept her out of a federal prison cell alongside our mother. Inside my home, the air smelled richly of roasted turkey cinnamon and warm sage. It was Thanksgiving evening. The dining room table was beautifully set with simple, elegant plates and glowing taper candles. I walked out of the kitchen carrying a large serving dish, smiling as I looked into the cozy living room. Ryan was sitting on the thick rug, gently bouncing our 6-month-old daughter on his knee. She giggled loudly, her tiny fists grabbing happily at his crisp button-down shirt. The doorbell chimed softly. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the front door. Jackson stood on the porch, holding a bottle of sparkling cider and a beautiful bouquet of autumn flowers. He looked entirely transformed. The dark circles under his eyes were completely gone, his posture was relaxed, and the heavy, toxic burden of manipulation had been entirely lifted from his shoulders. He was thriving. We did not share blood, but we shared the profound, unbreakable bond of surviving the exact same monsters. He walked inside, greeting Ryan with a warm hug and immediately reaching out to hold my daughter. We sat down together around the table, passing warm plates of food and sharing genuine, unfiltered laughter. We had built a completely new chosen family, grounded entirely in unwavering loyalty and absolute truth. I looked around the table, holding my husband's hand while my daughter babbled happily in her high chair. I thought back to that freezing night in the restaurant parking lot. My mother once told me to call a cab because my pain was an inconvenience to her. She did not realize that in that cab ride I was not just leaving for the hospital. I was leaving her behind forever. And the baby she tried to steal, she became the anchor of a family my mother will never be allowed to touch.